Oh, dude.
That was a horrendous crash.
Hey guys, welcome to Budget RC. As you can see, we've got the Desert Fox back on the bench, but for all the wrong reasons. I'd really hoped to continue that series with the Desert Fox versus the Yeti to help show how a lower priced vehicle can stack up against something more expensive. Unfortunately, the first time we took them out, we had a mishap. So now we're here with a busted truck, and we need to fix it. Now, in most cases, I'll give a vehicle the benefit of the doubt, especially after a hard hit like that, and I'll fix it with stock parts just to continue to see how they hold up. But with this vehicle, this is actually the second time I've had the exact same failure. A while back, I hit a park bench and had the exact same parts break. So now we're just going to go right to the upgrade path. Now, with some vehicles, an upgrade is pretty simple and straightforward. If you have a slash, you just buy your better parts and put them on and you're done. With some of these off-brands, it's not that easy because you don't have the parts from RPM and from Proline and from so on and so forth like you would with those other name brands. So you have to get a little bit more resourceful. And that's why instead of just fixing it, I'm going to show you guys what process I go through to try to make these sorts of upgrades on a vehicle that doesn't have the aftermarket parts availability. In the case of this vehicle, there are some aftermarket parts available, but what's available is generally low quality aluminum parts. And especially for the A-arms that we're dealing with here, I really don't want aluminum parts, especially the lower quality imported aluminum parts. So I wanted to find a different solution. And that means thinking out of the box and trying to find something from another vehicle that can be adapted to work here. So I've got a pile of parts here. We're going to go through the upgrade choices that I've made, but first I want to get this apart and give you a closer view of the damage. So taking this guy apart isn't really very complicated, but it is kind of time consuming. The only tools I needed to get to this point was my 2mm hex and the driver for my wheel nuts. So you just start by taking out the screws that hold the cage to the chassis, take the cage off, and then this whole assembly comes out in one piece once you take the screws from under here and a couple screws on this upper brace. Once those are out, the whole thing comes right out. Now that we've got it out, you can see our damage. We've got a busted control arm with the hinge pin bent and sticking out of the control arm, and the hinge pin retainer has been broken. These are the exact same three parts that I broke last time, and it's for a couple of reasons. One, this hinge pin retainer is just plastic, so it's a weak point. Secondly, this hinge pin is a very soft metal and allows it to bend. And because that can bend, it ends up causing all kinds of havoc, including taking the A-arm with it. So what I want to do now is replace all three of these with different parts. Replacing the stock parts is fairly easy, except Hobby King doesn't often have parts in stock for this vehicle, and if they do, the selection tends to be poor. Fortunately, this is a vehicle that's rebranded under other names, one of which is VRX. VRX has a line of vehicles, including short course trucks, which is exactly what this is, as well as some of their shorter buggies and some of their crossover vehicles with a solid rear axle but independent front. They all are based on the same platform, so those parts are available. There's a lot of parts availability under the VRX name as long as you know what part number to look for. The arms are part number 10112, and they're only a few bucks. And the replacement hinge pin retainers are parts 10120 and are only about $2. But they break. Fortunately, you can get both of those parts in aluminum. Like I'd said before, I'm not a fan of aluminum A-arms. But for the $12 that these hinge pin retainers cost, they're going to be a heck of a lot stronger than the plastic ones. So this is upgrade number one. The next issue is the hinge pin. You have a few options with hinge pins. You can straighten this one and reuse it. I've done that. This one's already been straightened once. But they're a very soft metal and they will bend again. Fortunately, they're just a standard 3mm diameter. That gives you the option of getting a hinge pin from a multitude of other vehicles as long as it's at least as long as the original one. If it's longer, you can cut it to the right length. I wanted to try something even different. What I decided to go with are drill bit blanks. These are a number 29 drill bit blank. And just like a drill bit, they're a hardened metal. And that makes them a little bit brittle, but it also makes it a lot stronger. So I'm guessing that I'm going to end up breaking other stuff before I break that. But even if I do break that, because it's brittle, instead of bending and destroying other parts, I'm hoping that that would end up being the sacrificial piece and the rest of my front end would remain intact. Hopefully we won't find out, but if I hit something and break something else, I'll let you know how it goes. So lastly, we have the control arm itself. This is going to be the most difficult thing to upgrade on these types of vehicles just because unless you want one of those cheap aluminum ones, you don't really have options. What you have to do is find something close that you can adapt. So I went through a bunch of my other vehicles to see what was close. I tried Stampede parts, I tried some Team Associated parts, and of all the things, it turns out that the axial Yeti arms are the closest thing. They're not exactly the same. It takes a little bit of tweaking, but they're close. If we hold these together, you can see that at the hinge pin, they're about the same length. If you get something that's a lot narrower at the hinge pin, you can shim it, but then when you hit something, because it's not all the way out at the edges, it puts a lot more force on that hinge pin. By getting something as close to the full length as possible, it's going to be a lot stronger. On the wheel end, everything looks pretty good, except that this area right between these mounts is a little bit too narrow for the caster block. But that's not necessarily a bad thing because that's really easy to fix. You can just open this up a little bit with a Dremel. The last thing that has to be done is how we retain the hinge pin. On the original arms, the hinge pin goes in from one side and has a little screw to help retain it. That's not how it works on the Yeti, so we had to improvise a solution. But the quick and easy way to do that is to just get yourself some 3mm grub screws, put them right into the end, and now you've got retainers at both sides to hold that hinge pin. Lastly, the only other thing we need to do is address the shock position. On these arms, the shock is designed to go inset here. On these original arms, you can see that the shock mounts to the outside. So we have a couple options here. If we hold this up, we can see that we can still utilize this position and move the shock right to one of these holes and mount it outboard just like it was originally, or we can try moving the shock inboard. We'll have to see how it affects the suspension geometry and go from there. So now let's get started with swapping these parts. All right, so now we're all back together. Overall, it was a fairly straightforward installation, but there were a few things that needed to be dealt with. When we were trying to put the pivot pins in, I discovered that those new aluminum pivot pin end housing sons of bitches, what the f*** are they called? One thing I noticed was that the holes in the pivot pin mounts were too small for the pivot pins. And I think that's either a machining tolerance issue or maybe the anodizing took up a little bit too much room. I'm not sure. I did have to open those up a little bit to get the pins to fit. It's not because the pins were a different diameter. I had the same problem when I tried to reuse the stock ones. Speaking of making those pins fit, the Yeti arms were designed to use a little bit smaller pin. These pins were actually a 3.4mm pin, not a 3mm. I did have to open up the Yeti arms on the inboard side. On the outboard side, those were a smaller 3mm pin, so those fit. The only changes there were to use the grub screws to hold the pins. The next thing that I needed to do in order to get these to fit, because these new Yeti arms were just a little bit narrower where they mount to the chassis than the original arms, I had to use a small spacer at the back of the arm over the pivot pin to take up the extra room. I happened to find a small black plastic bushing that was a perfect fit, but if you don't happen to have the perfect black bushing hanging around, you can just get a nylon bushing from the hardware store that's the right size, or one that's a little bit small and drill it out. Or you can actually use one of the small plastic 440 style Team Associated nuts that you can buy in a package. just drill out the center of that the right size, and that'll be almost a perfect fit as well. Just look around, it's pretty easy to find something to use as a spacer. Another difference is that this shock mount on the lower A-arm is closer to the chassis than it was on the original arms, which was further out. That's caused more droop. That's something that we're going to have to address by putting a little bit of a shim stack underneath the piston on the shocks so that these don't droop so far. For now, I just moved the spring collars up a little bit, but you can still see that it's really not quite enough. We're going to have to take up some of that in the shock. I also found these Yeti arms are just a little bit longer than the originals. Because of that, my camber and my toe were both screwed up. There's not really enough adjustment in these turnbuckles for me to get it where I'm happy with it. So I'm going to have to go with a little bit longer turnbuckle or go with a longer end link. A lot of these end links have already been replaced because the original ones were very, very soft and ended up stripping. Right now I'm using a Traxxas end link, but it's very short, so I don't have as much adjustment as I would like. I also noticed that this end link on the side that had the damage is bent. So we're going to take a look at end links. But other than that, we're back together and we're ready to roll again. Hope you guys found this helpful. I think this is going to be a pretty cool upgrade. It's going to add a lot of strength to this front end, and it should make this vehicle really a little bit more durable. Or it'll just move the forces somewhere else and we'll break other parts. I guess we'll see. But anyways, guys, I hope this was helpful. If this is something that interests you, make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe so that you'll see my next videos. I am going to get back to doing this comparison with the Yeti now that this is back together. So keep an eye open. Hopefully we'll get to those soon. Thanks, guys.